In the earlier part of the 20th century, the prevailing view in economics was that the job market is a self-equilibrating one. Unemployment was seen as a self-correcting problem. If there is a surge in joblessness, it was thought, then the wage will fall until employers put those idle hands to work. Economics saw every wave of mass layoffs as a transient hitch that could be remedied without government interference. The view of labor markets as self-equilibrating was shattered by the Great Depression. Soon after the stock market crashed on October 28, 1929, unemployment reached double digits and kept climbing for years. It seemed that those self-correcting mechanisms championed by economists of the day were, at best, just taking way too long. In order to explain why the Depression was dragging on without an end in sight, economists needed to amend their theory. Enter the British economist John Maynard Keynes. In 1936, he published his magnum opus, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, or the General Theory for short. The General Theory was Keynes's answer to the ongoing crisis. There he contends that the economics profession had made a mistake. Slumps in employment do not necessarily correct themselves after all. What economics had failed to recognize is the key role that wages play in generating economic growth. When unemployment increases and fewer wages are paid throughout the economy as a whole, the demand for commodities, which comes from wages, also falls. A decrease in consumption can cause fewer goods to be produced, slowing economic growth. Less economic growth, in turn, leads to lower wages. Lower wages makes for less consumption, which stunts growth, and so on. Keynes argues on these grounds that surges in joblessness may not alleviate themselves after all. Instead, it is possible in an otherwise well-functioning economy for mass unemployment to stretch on indefinitely, at least for quite a bit longer than the earlier economists would expect it to. On these grounds, Keynes advocated for what would otherwise be heretical to the economics discipline: government intervention in times of economic downturn. He saw government spending, for example, as the appropriate means to stop decreases in consumption from hindering economic growth. Keynesians hold that if lessened demand in the form of workers' consumption is offset by increased demand from the public coffers, then the worst of depressions can be kept at bay. The Keynesian viewpoint has been somewhat integrated into mainstream economics, albeit in varying degrees. Nowadays, most undergraduate economics students encounter Keynes's view of demand through the ISLM macroeconomic model. Keynes himself treated the correction of excess unemployment by government policy as a technical issue. He operates on the assumption that the government would, in fact, wish to correct unemployment if it could manage to do so. What Keynes did not consider is the possibility that certain interests represented in government might benefit from greater joblessness. This is exactly the possibility which is considered by Michael Kalecki in his 1943 paper called Political Aspects of Full Employment. As Kalecki points out, it does not take much pondering before one realizes that Keynes's doctrine has contentious political implications. Even if it is in the power of government to mitigate an economic downturn by increasing public expenditure, employers may be interested in a downturn if wages are high. A modest slump may even be good for profitability if it drives down wages more than it decreases output. Because it has an effect on the distribution of income, Kalecki holds that the proposed adoption of Keynesian government policy will be grounds for a political battle. An article called Political Aspects of Household Finance was published in 2018. In the spirit of Kalecki, authors Yoon Kim, Gilberto Lima, and Mark Setterfield show how the manipulation of a variable most often considered in the macroeconomic context, that is, household debt, it has effects on the distribution of income, and thus also it has hidden political implications. In this talk, we're going to explore the framework put forth in Political Aspects of Household Finance. Kim and colleagues start their paper with the following observation. Household indebtedness, income inequality, and consumption expenditures have all skyrocketed since the 1980s. Might these three phenomena be related? Political Aspects of Household Finance puts forth a model which explains how indeed they may be. Consider this following situation. Suppose that workers' incomes can come from two sources, wages and loans. Their incomes are diminished by interest paid on the money they borrow. When workers are successful in negotiating for higher wages, that wage increase may have one of two effects on workers' borrowing behavior. One possibility is that workers will defer enough of their wage gains towards debt repayment that the total debt burden they have begins to fall. If so, then the total amount of workers' consumption dependent on borrowing will also fall over time. The other possibility is that workers do not defer enough of their wage gains towards debt repayment for the total debt burden to begin falling. If they do this instead, then workers will need to continue borrowing ever increasing amounts of money in order to maintain their standard of living in the face of rising interest payments. So if workers are frugal with their extra wage income, and there's enough of it to go around, they can become less dependent on loans for their consumption. However, if they are too extravagant and the wage increase isn't much to begin with, workers can continue to become increasingly more dependent on borrowed funds. It is with these points in hand that Kim and colleagues introduce this key insight. Jobs are collateral for borrowing. Without jobs, workers cannot borrow money to spend in the form of consumption or debt servicing. The more money workers need to borrow, then, the more highly they value their jobs. Workers who depend more on borrowed funds and thus value their employment more are less inclined to undertake any acts which might cost them their jobs, chiefly aggressive bargaining for wage increases. We can conclude that workers who depend more on borrowing are in a worse position to bargain for higher pay, which pushes their wages downward. If this is indeed the case, then employers who benefit from decreasing workers' bargaining power will have an interest in worker borrowing. Hence the political implications of increasing household indebtedness. It increases the employer's position in wage bargaining. The fact that increasing indebtedness leads to lower wages, that can have reciprocal effects on income inequality. As increased indebtedness triggers a fall in wages, falling wages increase the necessity of workers to borrow for the sake of servicing debts. Increased borrowing creates farther indebtedness, which weakens workers' bargaining position, lowering their wages farther, and so on. It is through this mechanism that household debt and income inequality can create a feedback loop, multiplying each other. The authors of Political Aspects of Household Debt hypothesize that this is exactly what has taken place in the developed world since the 1980s. If you would like to read this paper, Political Aspects of Household Debt, it's linked in the description. That concludes this talk for today. Thank you to Mark Setterfield, one of the authors of this paper, for explaining it to me, helping me understand it. If you'd like to reach out to me, either to discuss history of economic thought or for purposes of tutoring in economics, please do so by filling out the form in the description of this video. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.